Chapter 1. The Disappearance. March 2010. Chandler, Arizona. The city sits in the heart of the Arizona desert, about 40 miles south of Phoenix. It's the kind of place where suburban America looks exactly like you'd imagine it. Quiet streets, shopping malls, golf courses, and neighborhoods filled with people who moved here for the promise of a fresh start. Chandler is safe, or at least, that's what everyone believes, until the day someone vanishes. Samantha Clark lived on Maple Street, in a modest two-bedroom house with pale yellow siding and a small front porch where she sometimes sat to read in the evenings. She was 32 years old, worked in administrative support at a downtown Phoenix office, and had lived in Chandler for 5 years. By all accounts, she was unremarkable in the best possible way, the type of person who showed up on time, paid her bills on time, and never caused drama. Her co-workers described her as reliable. Her friends called her dependable. Her mother called her every Sunday without fail. Samantha had a routine: wake at 6:45 a.m., coffee at 7:15, drive to work by 8, lunch at the same Italian place on Thursdays, grocery shopping on Saturdays, dinner with her mother on the second Sunday of every month. Life was predictable, safe, normal. Then, on March 17, 2010, that predictability ended. No one noticed immediately. That's the terrifying part of this story. In a world where we're supposedly connected to everyone all the time, through phones and emails and text messages, a woman can simply stop existing and nobody notices for more than 2 months. Samantha's boss, Richard Thompson, no relation to the man who would become central to this investigation, didn't think anything was unusual when she didn't show up on March 18th. She'd mentioned needing time off, something personal she was dealing with. He figured she was using her accumulated vacation days. When she didn't come back the following week, he tried calling. Her voicemail box filled up within 3 days. He left a message anyway, figuring she'd get back to him when she returned. 2 weeks passed. 3 weeks. By the end of April, Richard simply assumed Samantha had quit without formally notifying the company. People did that sometimes, especially in Arizona, where people came and went with the desert wind. Her best friend, Rebecca Mitchell, was the one who felt the first real sense of unease. Rebecca was 35, worked as a nurse at a local hospital, and had known Samantha since they'd met at a community college class 8 years earlier. They'd become close, the kind of friends who understood each other's silences, who knew which restaurants each other preferred, who could communicate entire conversations through a single glance. In early April, Rebecca texted Samantha, a simple message: "Hey babe, haven't heard from you in forever. Coffee this week?" No response. Rebecca waited 3 days and tried again. "Seriously, where have you been? You're worrying me a little." Still nothing. By mid-April, Rebecca had sent 3 messages and received not a single response. She called the house, the landline Samantha kept for emergencies. The phone rang and rang. She left a voicemail, her voice tight with concern. "Sam, it's me. I don't know what's going on, but this isn't like you. Call me back, okay? Please?" Rebecca would later tell investigators that she considered going to Samantha's house, but something held her back. "I thought maybe she was mad at me about something," Rebecca would say, her eyes filling with tears. "I thought maybe she needed space. I respected that. I didn't push it. That's what kills me now. I should have pushed." The neighbor 2 doors down, Tom Patterson, was more observant. Tom was 63, retired from a career in accounting, and spent much of his time tending to his garden and watching the neighborhood with the quiet attention of someone who had nothing but time. In late April, he noticed something odd. Samantha's car hadn't moved in weeks. Same position in the driveway, same angle. The back window was down just a fraction of an inch, exactly as it had been the last time he'd seen it. Tom mentioned this to his wife, Linda, as they sat on their porch one evening. "Samantha's been gone for a while," he said, sipping his iced tea. "Vacation?" Linda suggested. "Maybe, But her car's still there. Linda shrugged. Could be at the airport. Could be her boyfriend picked her up. That was the first mention of David Collins, though neither Tom nor Linda knew it at the time. He was just the boyfriend, a man who'd started appearing at Samantha's house in February, a man who looked ordinary and unremarkable, a man who would eventually destroy everything. The weeks continued. April turned into May. Samantha's life simply stopped. Then, on May 28th, 2010, 71 days after she disappeared, Samantha's mother finally called the police. Her name was Patricia Clark, and she was 60 years old. She'd spent the previous 2.5 months telling herself that her daughter had simply needed space, that Samantha was going through something personal and would explain everything when she was ready. But Patricia was a mother, and mothers know when something is wrong. They feel it in their bones. They wake up at 3 a.m. with a sense of dread they can't explain. Patricia had called the police department in Chandler and spoken to a dispatcher with a bored, tired voice. She reported her daughter missing, gave the details, age, height, distinguishing marks, when she was last seen, and waited for comfort. Instead, the dispatcher told her they'd send someone by in a few hours if they could fit it in. Missing adults weren't high priority. They came and went all the time. Most turned up within days. But Samantha Clark wouldn't turn up. Detectives Robert Henderson and Mike Carlson arrived at the house on Maple Street at 4:30 p.m. on May 28th. Henderson was 49 years old, with 21 years on the force, and the kind of tired eyes that come from seeing too much of human nature's dark side. Carlson was younger, 38, and still held on to some of his idealism, though it was fading with each case. What they found in that house would stay with them both for the rest of their lives. The front door was locked. Patricia had a key and let them in. The first thing Henderson noticed was the smell, or rather, the absence of it. The house should have smelled of decay, of abandonment. Instead, it smelled like industrial cleaner and something else. Something wrong. Jesus, Carlson muttered, and Henderson knew exactly what he meant. The house was obsessively clean, not normal clean, not I tidied up before leaving on vacation clean. This was the clean of someone making a statement. The bed was made with military precision. The dishes were washed and stacked in perfect rows. The carpets had been vacuumed, the corners sharp and precise. Even the books on the shelf appeared to have been arranged by size and color. In the kitchen, on the table, sat 3 saucers. Just 3. No plates, no evidence of a meal, just 3 saucers arranged in a triangle, as if someone had been about to serve tea to guests who never arrived. But it was the bedroom that confirmed Henderson's worst suspicions. On the nightstand, a framed photograph. Samantha smiling on a beach somewhere, maybe 10 years earlier, when her eyes still held the light of someone who believed good things could happen to her. The photograph was turned face down. Why would anyone turn a photograph of themselves face down? Unless they couldn't bear to look at it anymore. Unless they were saying goodbye. And on the floor, partially hidden by the bed frame, a small scrap of paper. Henderson picked it up carefully, using a tissue so as not to compromise any possible fingerprints. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, written by someone in emotional distress. 4 words. I don't know who I am. Patricia, standing in the doorway, let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. That's her handwriting, she whispered. That's definitely her handwriting. The investigation officially began that evening, though the first crucial weeks would prove to be frustrating, and ultimately fruitless. There was no body, no crime scene, no indication of struggle, just a woman who'd simply ceased to exist. In those early days, Henderson and Carlson interviewed everyone they could find who'd known Samantha, her mother, her best friend Rebecca, her boss Richard, neighbors, co-workers. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd been slowly disappearing long before she vanished. She changed, Rebecca told them, sitting in the police station with a cup of cold coffee in front of her, starting maybe 3 months before she disappeared. She was dating this guy, David Collins, and he was, I don't know how to describe it. He was nice, I guess, but there was something about him that made me uncomfortable. What do you mean? Henderson asked, leaning forward slightly. He was always there, always at the house, always watching, and Samantha became quieter, less like herself. I tried to ask her about it, but she would just say he was fine, that he was just private. But it was more than that. It was like he was erasing her, slowly. The mother described a similar pattern. She stopped calling as much, Patricia said. When I'd ask her to come to dinner, she'd say David didn't like going out much. When I suggested we get lunch, she'd say David preferred her to stay home. I thought maybe he was just introverted. I didn't want to judge. But now, Patricia didn't finish the thought. She didn't have to. The neighbor, Tom Patterson, provided a physical description. Medium height, brown hair, nothing particularly distinctive. He looked like any guy you'd pass on the street, but he always looked angry. Not angry like he was yelling, angry like his face was made that way, like something was broken inside him. But when Henderson and Carlson tried to locate David Collins, they ran into a wall. David Collins had no driver's license on file, no social security number, no employment history, no apartment lease, no medical records, no credit cards, no tax returns. It was as if the man simply didn't exist in any official capacity, which meant one of two things. Either David Collins was a ghost, or David Collins was hiding. Henderson had a hunch it was the latter. Chapter 2. The Ghost Man. The first thing Detective Henderson did was to pull every database his team could access. He worked late into the night on May 29th and 30, sipping black coffee and making phone calls to contacts in surrounding counties, driver's licenses, employment records, social security numbers, property ownership records, tax filings, credit card transactions. The name David Collins came back empty across nearly every system. It was like searching for smoke. But then, on the afternoon of May 31st, a credit card transaction from 18 months earlier caught Henderson's eye. A small purchase, $37 at a hardware store in Flagstaff, Arizona. The card was linked to a utility bill in New Mexico, a social security number that led nowhere, a name that didn't match any official record. Henderson made a call to an old friend in the Arizona State Police who had access to deeper databases. "I'm looking for aliases," Henderson said. "A guy who's been living under the name David Collins, probably late 30s, maybe early 40s, has a pattern of targeting women, controlling them." His friend, Officer Susan Martinez, came back 2 days later with a name: Michael Thompson. Henderson pulled the mugshot from 2002. His hands actually trembled when he saw it. Michael Thompson, 43 years old, born in Reno, Nevada. Criminal record stretching back to the early 1990s. Fraud, forgery, identity theft, credit card abuse, prison time, released 2002, and then nothing. For 8 years, Michael Thompson had simply vanished from every official record, until he resurfaced as David Collins. Henderson set the 2002 mugshot on his desk next to a photograph of David Collins that neighbors had provided. Same face, but the eyes were different. In the mugshot, the eyes were hollow, dead, like looking into a void. In the photograph, the eyes were warm, inviting, almost kind. It was the same person wearing 2 different masks. "Jesus Christ," Carlson muttered, standing over Henderson's shoulder. "How is that possible?" 8 years, Henderson said quietly. 8 years to perfect the mask. The investigation shifted. Henderson obtained Thompson's prison records and found something chilling. While incarcerated, Thompson had studied. Not in a productive way. He'd taken classes on psychology, manipulation, control. He'd read books about charm and persuasion. The prison chaplain reported that Thompson had once asked, "How do you make someone believe anything you want them to believe?" When the chaplain tried to turn it into a spiritual conversation, Thompson simply walked away. Thompson had been released in 2002 with no job prospects, no family support, and no obvious way to make a living. But then he'd disappeared, and when he reappeared 8 years later, he was living under an assumed identity, targeting vulnerable women through dating websites, running small cons that left no trace, siphoning off money through careful manipulation. And somewhere in that 8-year gap, he'd become even more dangerous. Henderson pulled old financial records from before Thompson had disappeared. There was a pattern. A woman in Las Vegas reported her identity stolen in 1997. Another woman in Albuquerque reported depression and memory loss after a 6-month relationship with a man who disappeared without warning in 1998. A third woman, Patricia Henderson, no relation to the detective, reported being physically and emotionally abused by a boyfriend named Michael Thompson for 14 months in 1998 and 1999. The pattern was clear. Michael Thompson was a predator, and he was evolving, becoming more sophisticated with each victim. Henderson made the call to bring in Patricia Thompson, the 1998 victim. She was now 47, living in Phoenix, working as a counselor at a domestic violence shelter. She agreed to meet with Henderson at a coffee shop near her office. She looked fragile when she arrived, though her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She ordered tea and didn't add any sugar to it. Henderson suspected she was someone who'd learned to prefer bitterness. "I haven't thought about Michael Thompson in over a decade," Patricia said quietly, "or tried not to anyway." "Tell me about him," Henderson said gently. Patricia took a long sip of her tea. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "He was charming. That's the thing nobody understands about men like him. They're not ugly or obvious. They're not the stereotypical monster. Michael was beautiful in his way, attentive. He would ask about my day. He'd remember things I'd mentioned weeks earlier. He made me feel seen, like I was the only person in the world that mattered to him." She paused, staring into her cup. But it was all an act. It was all performance. After maybe 2 months, the control started. Subtle at first. He'd comment on what I wore, not in an aggressive way, just casual observations that made me feel self-conscious. He'd suggest I spend less time with friends because they didn't appreciate our relationship. He'd tell me my job was unimportant, that I should quit and focus on us. And I bought it all because I thought he loved me. "What happened?" Henderson asked. "He left. One day, he was just gone. Took money from my account. Not all of it. Just enough that I didn't notice for a week. Left a note saying he'd decided to move to California and that he was sorry, but he needed to find himself. I didn't see him again for 15 years. And when you did see him again?" "I didn't," Patricia said. "But I heard about him. I was working at the shelter, and a woman came in with this exact same story. Different name, different guy, but the same story. She described a man who'd charmed her, controlled her, isolated her, stolen from her, and then disappeared. I recognized the pattern because I'd lived it. When I heard the name, David Collins, I knew it was him. Same pattern, different name, different victim." Henderson leaned back in his chair. "Did you report it?" Patricia shook her head. "I tried. I called the police station where she'd filed a report. They said if nothing violent had happened, there wasn't much they could do. I told them I thought this man might be dangerous, that he'd done this to me 15 years earlier, under a different name, but the officer I spoke to seemed more interested in ending the conversation than helping me." "Who was the victim?" Henderson asked urgently. "I can't tell you that," Patricia said. "Confidentiality at the shelter. But I can tell you this. That woman was already badly damaged when she came to us. She'd lost her job. Her family had disowned her for being involved with him. She had no sense of who she was anymore. Michael Thompson had done exactly what he wanted to do. He'd erased her. After the meeting, Henderson sat in his car for a long time without starting the engine. The implications were clear. Michael Thompson wasn't just a killer, or if he was, Samantha Clark might not be his first victim. Henderson pulled the 1992 missing persons file, the one he'd noticed in his research, the woman who'd disappeared 3 miles from where Thompson was living at the time. He requested the full file from the county records office. When it arrived 3 days later, he read it with growing dread. Rebecca Ann Morrison, 28 years old, had disappeared on June 8, 1992. She told her mother she was going to meet a friend for coffee. She never came back. The file contained a description of a man she'd been seeing. Charming, mysterious, worked in landscaping. The description could have matched hundreds of men in Arizona in 1992, but Henderson felt certain it was Thompson. How many others were there? How many women had Michael Thompson erased over the years? The breakthrough in finding Thompson came in February 2011. A traffic stop in New Mexico. A routine license check. The officer ran the plates on a stolen vehicle, and when he asked for identification, the driver gave a fake name. It didn't match anything in the system, but the fingerprints did. Michael Thompson was arrested on a routine traffic violation. When Arizona learned he was in custody, the wheels began to turn. Thompson was extradited back to Maricopa County in early March 2011. He said nothing during questioning, not a word, no explanations, no denials, just silence. The silence of someone who'd perfected the art of psychological control and knew that silence was the ultimate form of control. Chapter 3. Justice Without a Body. April 2011. 13 months after Samantha Clark disappeared, the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office made a decision that would define the entire investigation. They were going to prosecute Michael Thompson for second-degree murder, without a body. It was a gamble of epic proportions. Prosecutors rarely went after murders without physical evidence. Juries wanted to see bodies. They wanted blood and crime scenes and fingerprints on murder weapons. What they didn't want was to send someone to prison based on theory and circumstantial evidence. The burden of proof was supposed to be beyond a reasonable doubt. How could anyone prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt without a body? But Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen believed they could. Sarah was 44 years old, born in Phoenix, and had been a prosecutor for 16 years. She'd built her reputation on complex cases, the kind that required connecting dots that most people couldn't see. She was meticulous, brilliant, and, according to courtroom opponents, absolutely ruthless. She and Henderson met in her office on a Tuesday afternoon. The walls were covered with case files, photographs, and evidence boards. Chen looked exhausted. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Can we win this?" Henderson asked, sitting across from her. Chen looked up from the file she was reading. Her eyes were intense, dark with conviction. "We have to," she said simply, "because if we don't, he walks, and he'll do this again. We both know he will." The evidence was circumstantial, but Sarah was right about one thing. It was damning. The rope purchased on March 16th, the bleach, the plastic sheeting, the surveillance footage from the convenience store showing Thompson loading boxes, and something large, something heavy, into a truck at midnight. The note in Samantha's handwriting, "I don't know who I am." The financial records showing Thompson's mounting debts in the months before Samantha disappeared. The pattern of abuse from Patricia, the hints of earlier victims. And then there was the absence itself. Samantha's complete, total, irrevocable disappearance from the world. No bank transactions, no phone calls, no email, no credit card usage, no social media activity, no forwarding address, no contact with her family, nothing. It was as if Samantha Clark had simply been erased. People don't disappear like that unless someone makes them disappear. The trial was scheduled to begin in late October 2011. 6 months for the prosecution to build their case. 6 months for the defense to prepare their counter-narrative. The defense attorney was Mark Reynolds, a man with silver hair and a reputation for creating reasonable doubt in the minds of juries. He'd won 70% of his cases over a 20-year career. He'd gotten accused murderers acquitted through clever cross-examination and the simple principle that the burden of proof lay with the prosecution. Reynolds came out swinging. During a preliminary hearing in August, he argued that the prosecution had no case. "No body," he said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "No murder weapon. No confession. No witnesses to a crime. My client purchased some items at a hardware store. Millions of Americans purchase rope and bleach. Does that make them murderers? I think not. The prosecution is trying to put together a narrative without a single brick of evidence to build on." Henderson watched Reynolds work and felt his stomach twist. The man was good. He was very good, and juries liked him. By October, Henderson was beginning to feel the weight of doubt. Not doubt in Thompson's guilt. He was certain Thompson was guilty, but doubt in whether an Arizona jury would convict someone of murder without a body. It had been done before, but it was rare, very rare. The trial began on November 3rd, 2011. The courtroom was packed. Samantha's mother sat in the front row, her face grey with grief and exhaustion. Rebecca Mitchell sat beside her, holding her hand. In the third row, a woman in her 50s named Margaret sat taking notes. She was juror number 7, and her sharp, evaluating eyes suggested she was the kind of person who paid attention to every detail. Michael Thompson sat at the defense table, wearing a navy suit and a white dress shirt. He looked ordinary, forgettable. He could have been anyone, a banker, an accountant, a middle-level manager. There was nothing about him that suggested violence or cruelty, and that, Henderson understood, was precisely what made him dangerous. He could be anyone. He could be trusted. He could move through the world without suspicion. Sarah Chen began her opening statement on the morning of November 4th. She was brilliant. She laid out the timeline methodically, showing the jury how Michael Thompson had slowly taken over Samantha Clark's life. She described the note, "I don't know who I am," and explained that this wasn't the cry of a woman choosing to leave. This was the cry of a woman losing herself, being erased by someone who was systematically destroying her sense of self. By March 2010, Chen said, pacing before the jury, Samantha Clark had no one, no support system, no friends, no family connections. The defendant had made sure of that. He'd isolated her completely. And when she became a liability rather than an asset, when she could no longer serve his purposes, he disposed of her. Mark Reynolds then stood and presented the defense's narrative. He acknowledged Thompson's background. Yes, he'd used a false identity. Yes, he'd been in Samantha's life. Yes, circumstances looked suspicious. But suspicion wasn't proof. And without a body, without a crime scene, without any physical evidence of murder, the prosecution was asking the jury to convict a man based on speculation and circumstance. What if Samantha Clark simply wanted to disappear? Reynolds asked. What if she was unhappy and wanted to start a new life? People do that. They leave their old lives behind and start fresh. Is that a crime? Should we send a man to prison because a woman chose to leave him? Henderson felt the doubt settling over the courtroom like fog. He could see it in the jurors' faces. Margaret was writing something down, her expression unreadable. The prosecution called its witnesses over the next 5 days. Patricia Thompson took the stand and described in painful detail what it felt like to be under Michael Thompson's control. She spoke about the psychological manipulation, the slow erosion of identity, the feeling of becoming invisible. By the end, Patricia said, her voice steady, but her eyes filled with pain, I was just a shell. He'd hollowed me out. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I was just a game to him, something he was working on, erasing me, piece by piece. The jury watched her with compassion, but Henderson could see the question in their eyes. Does she prove he's a murderer, or just that he's a terrible person? The convenience store clerk testified about selling rope, bleach, and plastic sheeting to a man matching Thompson's description on March 16, 2010. The security footage showed Thompson's face clearly, but Reynolds tore into him on cross-examination. "Millions of Americans buy rope and bleach," Reynolds said. "My client bought these items. That doesn't make him a murderer. Circumstance isn't evidence." A forensic accountant detailed Thompson's financial desperation in the months before Samantha disappeared. Thompson had been running small cons, targeting vulnerable women, but the money was drying up. He needed something bigger, something permanent. Samantha had a house. Samantha had a job. Samantha had assets. He had motive, Chen argued. He had the means, and most importantly, he had the opportunity. But Reynolds shook his head. Motive and opportunity, without proof of the crime itself, are not sufficient to convict. The prosecution wants to tell you a story, but stories aren't evidence. By the end of the prosecution's case, on November 10th, Henderson was deeply concerned. Chen had done excellent work, but it was all circumstantial. They had no body. They had no murder weapon. They had no confession. They had theory and speculation and a pattern of behavior. Reynolds had a point. Story wasn't evidence. But then came the prosecution's final witness. It was a woman Henderson had found in his investigation, a woman who'd been too frightened to come forward earlier. Her name was Amanda, and she'd been parked near Samantha's house on the night of March 15th, 2010. "I saw a man loading boxes into a truck," Amanda testified, her voice shaking slightly. "One of the boxes split open and cash fell out, hundreds of dollars, just falling on the ground." "What time was this?" Chen asked. "Around midnight, maybe a little after, and he was struggling with something else, something big and heavy. He kept looking around like he didn't want anyone to see." Reynolds stood for cross-examination, and Henderson could feel the defense attorney's confidence. This was hearsay. This was speculation. An anonymous woman claiming to have seen something on a dark street 12 hours before a disappearance. "You were parked on a dark street at midnight," Reynolds said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "How could you possibly see what was in those boxes?" "One split open," Amanda said. "I saw the money." "You think you saw money. In the dark. From a distance. Is that correct?" "I know what I saw. Do you?" Reynolds leaned forward. "Or are you simply trying to help the prosecution tell their story?" Amanda hesitated for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, but that was all Reynolds needed. That night, Sarah Chen sat in her office with her head in her hands. "We might lose this," she told Henderson. "Reynolds is planting doubt, and I can see it working. I can see it in the jurors' faces." Henderson didn't respond. He was thinking about Samantha, about Samantha's mother sitting in that courtroom day after day, waiting for justice that might never come. But then Chen lifted her head, and Henderson saw the determination in her eyes. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "we put him on the stand." It was a calculated risk. Defense attorneys rarely put their clients on the stand in murder cases. But Thompson had insisted. He wanted to speak. He wanted to testify to his innocence. Reynolds had argued against it, but Thompson was adamant. The next morning, November 11th, Michael Thompson took the stand. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Thompson wore the same navy suit. His face was composed, expressionless. He looked directly at the jury as he was sworn in. Sarah Chen approached him carefully. "Where is Samantha Clark?" she asked. Thompson stared at her. His face was blank, empty. "I don't know," he said. "You don't know," Chen repeated, her voice sharp with incredulity. "You spent nearly every night at her house for 3 months. You were the last person to see her. You bought rope and bleach the night before she disappeared. You loaded something heavy into your truck at midnight. You fled the state. And you don't know where she is? I don't know, Thompson repeated. Chen stepped closer. Did you kill Samantha Clark? No. Did you hide her body? No. Then where is she, Mr. Thompson? And Thompson just stared. He didn't answer. He didn't blink. He didn't shift in his seat. He sat there in complete silence, and that silence was more damning than any confession could have been. Because in that silence, everyone in the courtroom understood. Michael Thompson knew exactly what had happened to Samantha Clark. He simply didn't care enough to tell anyone. Margaret, the juror with the sharp eyes, leaned forward. Her face had changed. Her expression had shifted from uncertainty to absolute certainty. That evening, Henderson sat with Sarah Chen in her office. I think we have them, Chen said quietly. You think? Henderson asked. No, Chen corrected herself. I know. I saw it in Margaret's face. That juror just made her decision. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 long, agonizing days during which Henderson couldn't eat and Chen couldn't sleep. On November 18, 2011, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom filled with people. Samantha's mother, Rebecca Mitchell, the prosecution team, the defense team, the media, everyone waiting for the words that would either bring justice or confirm that evil could walk free. We find the defendant, Michael Thompson, guilty of second-degree murder. Samantha's mother let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Rebecca held her as she began to cry, tears of grief, of vindication, of the terrible knowledge that her friend was dead. Michael Thompson showed no reaction. His face remained blank, empty, as if none of this mattered, as if he'd already checked out and gone somewhere else entirely. At sentencing, 2 weeks later, the judge looked at Thompson with something close to contempt. You have shown no remorse, the judge said, no humanity. You have refused to tell this court, or this victim's family, what you did with Samantha Clark. You have denied them closure. You have denied them peace. For that, and for the crime you committed, I sentence you to 54 years in prison. Thompson was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, Henderson stood with Sarah Chen. The November sun was warm on their faces. They'd won. Justice had been served. But it didn't feel like victory. We got him, Chen said quietly. Yeah, Henderson replied. But we still don't know where she is. That question, the one that had haunted them both for nearly 2 years, remained unanswered. Where is Samantha Clark? Chapter 4. The Earth Remembers Everything, June 2018. 7 years after Michael Thompson was convicted. 7 years of silence. The case had faded from the headlines. Samantha Clark's name appeared occasionally in true crime blogs and podcasts, but mostly she was forgotten. Her mother, Patricia, had moved to California to be closer to her sister. She couldn't bear to live in Chandler anymore, couldn't drive past Maple Street without her hands trembling. Rebecca Mitchell had married a firefighter named David and had a daughter she'd named Samantha in honor of her best friend. But Rebecca still thought about her friend every single day. Every single day. Detective Henderson had retired in 2013, 2 years after the conviction. He'd spent 30 years in law enforcement, and by the time he walked away, he was burned out. He'd seen too much. He'd lost too much faith in the system. He spent his retirement years in a small cabin in northern Arizona, trying to find peace in isolation. But he never found it. Not really. Because he still wondered about Samantha. Still wondered what Thompson had done with her body. Still wondered if there were other victims they'd never found. Michael Thompson sat in his cell at Florence State Prison, about an hour's drive from Chandler. He'd been a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, invisible. He worked in the prison library, shelving books and maintaining records. Other inmates left him alone. The guards had learned not to engage him in conversation. He was the type of prisoner who disappeared into the routine, who became almost invisible in his compliance. But on a hot Tuesday morning in June 2018, Everything changed. A construction crew arrived at a property near Riggs Road and Arizona Avenue in Chandler, less than 3 miles from Maple Street, where Samantha Clark had disappeared. It was a landscaping business, one that had been in operation for 26 years. The owner, Richard Valdez, had decided to expand. New irrigation lines needed to be dug. The back section of the property, which hadn't been used in over a decade, needed to be developed. The area was overgrown, wild, forgotten. Nobody ever went back there. It had been years since anyone had paid attention to it. A backhoe operator named Carlos Martinez had been working in landscaping for 23 years. He'd dug through countless acres of Arizona earth. He'd seen rocks, roots, old metal, garbage. He'd seen the detritus of human life buried under decades of dirt and time. But he'd never seen this. Carlos was 55 years old. He had a wife named Maria, 3 adult children, and 5 grandchildren. He lived a quiet, simple life. He went to work, did his job, came home, had dinner with Maria, watched television, and went to bed. It was a good life. It was a stable life. It was the life of a man who'd made peace with the world and his place in it. Around 10:30 a.m. on June 12, 2018, Carlos was digging new irrigation lines in the back section of the property. The soil was hard-packed, difficult to move. The backhoe groaned under the strain. At first, Carlos thought he'd hit rock. The machine suddenly lurched and stopped, and Carlos felt the jolt through his hands on the controls. He climbed down to investigate. What he saw at first didn't register. His brain couldn't quite process it. Bones. Pale bones scattered in the trench, partially buried in dirt that had turned dark with time and moisture. At first, Carlos thought it was an animal, a large dog maybe, or a coyote. But as he stared, the shape began to make sense. The angle of the skull, the length of the femur, the positioning of the ribs. This wasn't an animal. Carlos stepped back from the trench. His hands were shaking. He thought about calling his wife, about telling her that he'd seen something that would change him forever. He thought about how he'd never be able to look at Earth the same way again, how every time he dug into soil, every time he moved dirt, he'd think about this moment. He thought about the woman to whom these bones had belonged, about what those final hours must have been like. Then he called his supervisor. "We need to stop," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to stop right now. We need to call the police." Within an hour, the property was swarming with police vehicles. Yellow tape went up. Forensic teams arrived. News vans lined the street outside. A perimeter was established. By the end of the day, half of Chandler knew that something significant had been discovered. The remains were excavated carefully over the next 2 days. Skeletal remains, mostly intact. The bones were carefully documented, photographed, and catalogued. The remains were wrapped in what was left of plastic sheeting that had deteriorated over the 8 years it had been buried. And buried with the remains, a driver's license, faded, water-damaged, but still readable. Samantha Clark. The news reached Henderson at his cabin in northern Arizona. He was sitting on his porch, reading a book, when his cell phone rang. It was his old partner, Mike Carlson, still working in the force despite his age. "We found her," Carlson said simply. Henderson didn't need to ask who. He knew. He'd been waiting for this call for 8 years. 7 years in retirement, and every single day he'd wondered if this phone call would come. "Where?" Henderson asked. "The landscaping business. Riggs in Arizona. Less than 3 miles from her house." Henderson looked out at the mountains in the distance. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He felt something shift inside him. Relief, grief, vindication, all of it at once. "Tell Sarah Chen," he said finally. "She deserves to know." The forensic analysis took weeks. Dental records confirmed the remains. Samantha Marie Clark, age 32, missing since March 17, 2010. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull. She'd been struck multiple times from behind. Death would have been quick. But the forensic anthropologist noted something else. There were tool marks on the bones suggesting the body had been dismembered. Thompson hadn't just killed Samantha. He'd butchered her. He'd broken her body into pieces so it would be easier to transport and bury. The investigation that followed revealed something even more chilling. The landscaping company where Samantha's remains were found had been owned, in 2009 and 2010, by Richard Valdez. And Richard Valdez had hired several temporary workers during that period, including a man named David Collins who'd done odd jobs around the property. Thompson had worked there, had access to the entire property, knew the layout, knew which areas were never used, never checked, never visited. He'd spent months surveying the landscape, finding the perfect place to bury his victim. He'd chosen a spot that was so overgrown, so forgotten, that it would take 8 years for anyone to look there. 8 years. And then only because someone finally decided to develop that particular section. Michael Thompson had planned Samantha's burial as meticulously as he'd planned her death. Henderson drove down from his cabin when he heard the news. He went to the property on Riggs Road and stood at a distance, watching the forensic team's work. He thought about Samantha Clark, about her last moments, about what Thompson had done to her. Then he drove to Florence State Prison. The visiting room at Florence was designed to discourage contact between prisoners and visitors. Thick glass separated them. Communication happened through phones. Everything was recorded. Everything was monitored. The room smelled like industrial disinfectant and despair. Michael Thompson was brought to the visiting area in handcuffs. He sat across from Henderson, separated by the reinforced glass. His face was older now, his hair grayer, but his eyes were exactly the same. Empty, hollow, dead. Henderson picked up the phone on his side. Thompson picked up the one on his. "We found her," Henderson said quietly. Thompson's face didn't change. Not a flicker of emotion. Not a trace of surprise. "I know," Thompson said. "You know?" Henderson felt anger rising in him. "How do you know? You've been in prison." "Visitors talk," Thompson said. "Guards talk. News gets around." Henderson leaned forward. "Why? Why didn't you just tell us where she was? Why make her family suffer for 8 years? Why make her mother spend those years not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead?" And then something happened that Henderson had never seen before. Something crossed Michael Thompson's face. Not emotion exactly, but something else. Something colder and darker and more terrible than emotion could ever be. Thompson leaned forward, his hand pressing against the glass. "Because," he said slowly, his voice absolutely calm, "they needed to learn what it felt like. To lose someone completely. To have no answers, no closure. To wonder every single day if she was alive or dead, if she was suffering, if she was calling for them. That's what Samantha felt with me. That's what they deserve to feel too." Henderson stared at him. The calculated cruelty, the absolute absence of humanity, the deliberate choice to extend Samantha's mother's suffering for as long as possible. "You're a monster," Henderson said quietly. Thompson tilted his head, almost curious, almost amused. "No," Thompson said. "I'm just honest about what I am. Most people lie to themselves. They pretend they're good. They pretend they have morals and ethics and compassion. I don't pretend. I am exactly what I am. Nothing more, nothing less." Henderson stood to leave. He was done with this man. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to understand. He'd learned all he needed to know about the depths of human cruelty. But then Thompson spoke again. "Detective?" Henderson stopped. He didn't turn around. "There were others," Thompson said. His voice was casual, conversational. "Before Samantha, before Patricia, women who disappeared, women no one looked for because I made sure no one would. You found one, but you'll never find them all." Henderson felt his stomach twist. He turned back to face the glass. "How many?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Thompson smiled. It was the first genuine expression Henderson had ever seen on his face, and it was the most terrifying thing Henderson had ever witnessed. It wasn't a human smile. It was something broken and wrong and utterly inhuman. It was the smile of something that had learned to mimic humanity, but had no actual connection to what it meant to be human. "Enough," Thompson said. Henderson walked out of the visiting room. His legs felt weak. He made it to his car before his hands started shaking so badly he couldn't grip the steering wheel. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, without starting the engine, trying to process what Thompson had just told him. Enough. How many was enough? 5? 10? More? The news of Thompson's confession broke within weeks. Investigators in Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and California opened cold cases from the 1990s and 2000s, missing women who disappeared under suspicious circumstances, women who fit Thompson's victim profile, women whose cases had gone cold and forgotten. They began searching, in basements, in remote properties, in places Thompson had lived or worked. Some searches turned up remains, others turned up nothing, but the search would continue for years. Samantha's mother flew back to Arizona for the funeral. It was a small ceremony, held at a cemetery on the north side of Chandler, under an old oak tree. Samantha's mother placed flowers on the grave, white roses, because Samantha had loved white roses. Rebecca Mitchell stood beside her, holding her hand. Sarah Chen was there. Henderson was there. They stood in silence for a long time. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. Nothing that could ease the pain of a mother burying her daughter, a friend burying her best friend. Afterward, Henderson stood with Sarah Chen at the edge of the cemetery. "We got him," Chen said quietly. "He's never getting out. He'll die in prison." "Yeah," Henderson replied. "But how many others are still out there? How many women are buried in places we'll never find?" Chen didn't answer. There was no good answer. Carlos Martinez, the construction worker who'd first discovered Samantha's remains, changed jobs within months of the discovery. He couldn't work in landscaping anymore. Every time he moved earth, every time he dug into soil, he saw bones. He saw Samantha Clark's skeletal remains in every handful of dirt. He moved to California with his wife Maria. He took a job working in a warehouse. But sometimes, when he was lying in bed at night, he'd think about that moment. The moment when his backhoe hit bone. The moment when he discovered that the earth beneath our feet holds secrets we're never meant to uncover. The story of Samantha Clark came to an end with her funeral. Her case was officially closed. Michael Thompson was serving his 54-year sentence, now with the additional knowledge that the remains of his victim had been found, that he could no longer deny what he'd done. But the story of Michael Thompson's other victims was just beginning. Investigators would search for years. Some remains would be found. Others would stay buried. Some women would remain missing, their families never knowing what happened to them, never finding closure. Justice had been served for Samantha. Her family had gotten closure, of a sort. They knew what had happened. They could bury her properly. They could grieve with certainty, rather than with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing. But the earth still held secrets, and some of them would never be uncovered. In his cell at Florence State Prison, Michael Thompson continued his routine. He shelved books in the prison library. He spoke to no one. He showed no remorse. He simply existed in his isolation, waiting for the day, decades in the future, when he would die. And Detective Henderson, in his cabin in northern Arizona, would spend the rest of his life wondering about the other victims, the other women, the other families who would never know what happened to their loved ones, because Michael Thompson had made sure they would never know. He had erased them so completely that the world had forgotten they'd ever existed. And some erasures, once complete, could never be undone. The earth remembers everything, but sometimes the earth keeps its secrets forever. Epilogue. In 2022, 12 years after Michael Thompson's conviction, investigators using new forensic technology discovered remains of a second victim buried in a remote area of New Mexico where Thompson had lived in the mid-1990s. The remains were identified as belonging to Jennifer Morrison, who had disappeared in 1995. She was 29 years old at the time of her disappearance. Michael Thompson refused to discuss the case when questioned by investigators. As of 2024, 3 other sets of remains have been tentatively linked to Michael Thompson, though definitive identification has not yet been made. Investigators believe there may be others. Michael Thompson is currently serving his 54-year sentence at Florence State Prison in Arizona. He is now 68 years old. If he lives to the end of his sentence, he will be 122 years old, an unlikely occurrence given his age and health. But Michael Thompson has not confessed to any murders beyond the implicit confession he made to Detective Henderson during that prison visit. He continues to maintain silence about what he did with the bodies of his victims. And so, for the families of the missing women, the search continues. They search in forests and deserts, in abandoned properties and remote locations. They search in hopes of finding closure, of bringing their loved ones home, of giving them proper burials and final resting places. The earth holds these secrets, and perhaps one day the earth will give them up, but perhaps not.